Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and this is the video lecture notes for Standard 10.2.4, which is an essential standard, the French Revolution. The essential question that I might ask is, why did the French Revolution lead to a tyranny instead of a democracy? Next slide. There's the bubble map. I have this tic-tac-toe board because tic-tac-toe is kind of like the French Revolution. It's a metaphor. The X gets the extra turn and the O does not, and the X has an advantage just like the rich did in the French Revolution. Next slide. The first heading is entitled The Old Regime, it's pronounced. Like the American Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789 erupted after years of yearning. That is, this thing had been building for years. Next slide. For centuries, France had been ruled by a series of absolute monarchs. Next slide. Louis XVI, who reigned from the mid-1600s all the way to 1715, was probably France's most famous monarch. Next slide. Louis XIV ruled over France for over 70 years. He started at age 4, and this occurred during the late 16 and early 1700s. Next slide. Louis's nickname was the Sun King. Next slide. He once said, "I am to France as the sun is to the earth," meaning that he was pretty important, he thought anyway. Next slide. He is one of the best examples of an absolute monarch in any country, in any period. Next slide. Another famous quote of Louis XIV was, quote, "I am the state," end quote. Next slide. His home, the Palace of Versailles, was built during his reign. The Palace of Versailles, which was built just outside of Paris, is one of the great palaces ever built. 1,300 rooms. It took 28 years to build. Hundreds and hundreds of acres of garden and fountains, and it's just absolutely amazing. Still stands today as a museum. Next slide. It is probably the most elaborate palace ever built. This is one of the most famous rooms in the palace, a room known as the Hall of Mirrors. Next slide. Before the French Revolution, France was divided into 3 social classes. Next slide. The first estate was made up of high-ranking clergy of the Catholic Church. This group largely opposed Enlightenment ideas. In other words, the Catholic Church did not want to bring about any change in France at this time. They liked their position as it was. Next slide. This group, that is, high officials of the Catholic Church, made up less than 1% of France's population, and they paid little, if any, taxes. And this visual shows the first and second estates on top of the third. Lots of pictures like this. Next slide. The second estate was made up of the nobility. Next slide. Most nobles opposed Enlightenment ideas. In other words, they didn't want any change either. They liked the status quo, the way the system was. They made up about 2% of the population and paid little or no taxes. Taxes are a big part of this. The third estate included the bourgeoisie, which is the middle class, the urban lower class, and peasant farmers. Next slide. This estate, that is the third estate, had little or no power to influence the government. Next slide. This group supported the Enlightenment ideas and resented the wealthy. Next slide. The third estate made up 97% of the population and paid most of the taxes. Next slide. French society under the old regime was structured unfairly in favor of the nobility, that is, the first and second estates. Next slide. The monarchy and the upper classes had privileges and the commoners had none. Again, this visual is great. You got the king and the nobility here, and you've got the church exploiting the third estate, which is carrying the burden here. Next slide. The Estates General, which had existed for centuries in France, as a parliament was unfairly structured to favor the upper classes. Next slide. Louis XVI, who happened, unfortunately for him, to be the monarch of France during the French Revolution, was weak, and his government was faced with extreme economic problems. Next slide. The next section of the unit or the standard is entitled the Constitutional Monarchy here. In 1789 was a key year of the French Revolution. Next slide. Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette caused severe economic problems for France. There's Marie Antoinette and there's Louis right there. Next slide. To get money to pay off France's debts and to run the government, Louis was forced to call a meeting of France's parliament, which was known as the Estates General. Next slide. 1789 was the first time in 175 years that the Estates General had met. Next slide. Under the rules of the Estates General, each estate had one vote. Therefore, the rich had 2 votes and the poor had 1. The nobility had a vote, the Catholic Church had a vote. That's 2 votes. The third estate, which was everyone else, had a vote. And so this was an example of the unfair system that existed in France and had existed for centuries. Next slide. Under this system, the privileged classes always outvoted the third estate 2-1. Next slide. Amidst this turmoil, in May of 1789, representatives of the third estate refused to meet with the other 2 estates. Next slide. They demanded, that is, the third estate demanded that changes were made in the system of voting, which gave the rich an advantage. Next slide. In response, Louis XVI locked the representatives out of their regular meeting place, so they met in an indoor tennis court. Next slide. It was during that meeting that the Third Estate formed France's first truly democratic organization called the National Assembly. Next slide. Also during this time in Paris, rumors suggested that Louis XVI would use the military to dismiss the Estates General, that is the National Assembly. Next slide. In response, the people of Paris began to gather weapons to defend the city, and this is a photograph showing that outside of the Bastille. Next slide. On July 14th, 1789, a mob attacked the Bastille. This event symbolized the beginning of the revolution. These are commoners outside, the revolutionaries. The Bastille symbolized centuries of oppression that the monarchy and the upper classes had over the French people, and the attack on the Bastille was an outgrowth of that centuries-long frustration. Next slide. July 14th is still celebrated as French Independence Day to this very day. Next slide. The new National Assembly wrote France's first democratic document, known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man, very similar to our Declaration of Independence, certainly inspired by it. Next slide. This document guarantees citizens equal justice, freedom of speech, and religion. Next slide. By the way, this is a new heading entitled Constitutional Monarchy. The National Assembly took away the privileges of the nobility. Next slide. The Catholic Church also lost privileges. Church property was sold to help pay the national debt. Next slide. The first part of the French Revolution was welcomed by the French people. Next slide. New heading, Democratic Despotism. In 1792, the French Revolution became more radical. At this time, France was at war with its neighbors, countries like Spain and Austria, Prussia. Next slide. In 1792, France abandoned monarchy and became a republic. In other words, powers were stripped away from Louis XVI, and France became a republic, kind of like the United States. Next slide. During this period, Louis XVI tried to sneak out of the country along with his family. He was arrested and put under custody. Next slide. Later that year, he was found guilty of treason and executed. Here's a photograph, or excuse me, a painting of that. Here's Louis XVI's head, and it's being held in front of the Paris mob. Next slide. After the death of Louis XVI, Maximilien Robespierre came to power as a dictator within the National Assembly and National Convention. Next slide. He sought to rid France of all the ills of the past by wiping out the Christian and old regime heritage of France. Next slide. His goal was to create a new France by wiping out all elements of the past. Next slide. Under the rule of Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety sought to wipe out members of the First and Second Estates, and the guillotine became the symbol of that attempt. Next slide. This period was known as the Reign of Terror. It was a period of confusion and bloody turmoil. 1792 and 3. Next slide. This period ended with Robespierre himself being beheaded. He was accused of being a traitor to the French people and beheaded. The guillotine. After Robespierre's death, a more moderate government took over France in 1795, and it was known as the Directory. This government helped to restore the order after the turmoil of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. Next slide. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized control of power from the Directory and ruled France as a dictator from 1799 to 1815. Next slide. Napoleon's rule weakened democracy in France. Lasting democracy would not come to France until almost 100 years after the French Revolution in 1875. Next slide. Today, people around the world still yearn for freedom sought by the French during their revolution. Next slide. And here's a chart showing the phases of the French Revolution. 1789 to 91 was a period of great change and positive change. 1792 and 93, that's when the revolution fell under turmoil. And then 1792 to 95 was when the Reign of Terror occurred. Robespierre, France trying to hold off their enemies, France trying to change their entire system. And then 1795 to 99 is when the Directory ran, and eventually Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew this government. Next slide. And there's our bubble map. Thank you, class.